we're of course living at a time when it's religion that's making all the news, or at least ISIS is. For what it's worth, I think we're living through the final flare-up of Islam, and that it will actually die out in due course or decline in importance. It's failed its people more or less everywhere, conceivably not Indonesia. But that's not my talk for tonight, which is about atheism, which is in a sense the wider picture in the modern world, because everywhere in the developed West, and including the United States, which until recently has been the odd man out or the odd woman out, even there the growth of atheism is the dominant story. Religion is only really growing in the poorer areas of the modern world, and I think it's relatively easy to understand why that should be so. I'd like to begin by a handful of quotes which I think show us that we're all concerned with meaning in life. Here's a quote from Clifford Geertz, the well-known American anthropologist. "The drive to make sense out of experience, to give it form and order, is evidently as real and pressing as the more familiar biological needs. Wittgenstein, we feel that even when all possible scientific questions have been answered, the problems of life remain completely untouched. Carl Jung, man cannot stand a meaningless life. Ortega y Gasset, the Spanish philosopher, life cannot wait until the sciences have explained the universe scientifically. We cannot put off living until we are ready. George Steiner, the English emigre critic, we must wager on meaning's existence. I love that. And W.H. Auden, meaning is not a security blanket. I love that too. But lest we get too serious, there's the materialist slogan, he who has the most toys when he dies wins. And for those of you who remember the 1983 Monty Python film, Monty Python and the Meaning of Life, their answer was be kind to fish and wear more hats. So we can't be too serious about this. But I'd like to ask you all a question here going on. Just put up your hand if you feel you're missing something in life. Reluctance, I would say maybe about 20%. Well, I start my book with this very question because I'm a great fan of the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas, and he attended a funeral in the early 90s for Max Frisch, the Swiss dramatist, in Zurich. And Max Frisch was an atheist, but his funeral started in a church. There were no hymns, there were no prayers, but the local diocese had made available the space for Max Frisch, and his partner, widowed partner, thanked the Zurich diocese. And Habermas said that he didn't think that this was odd at the time, but as the years went by, it became odder and odder to him, and in 2008, he wrote a famous essay called An Awareness of What is Missing. And he'd come to the conclusion that for atheists, there is something missing. And lots of philosophers leapt on this. Thomas Nagel, the New York philosopher, said, yes, he said, I think life is something tremendous. And we don't really have the kit mentally to live up to the tremendousness of life. And Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher and Christian, said, well, I think that atheists are a subtraction story. They lead less fulfilling lives than religious people because we religious people, we're not as buffered, was his word. We're not as closed in as atheists. We can take part in the whole life that religion gives us. Habermas then came back and he said, really, I think we've been misled in life by monotheism. And we've been misled by the idea that there is one cosmos. To think that there's one big thing in life, which if we can only discover it, we will be fulfilled. And he thought that this was the basic conundrum of where we live now. And he thought there might be a way out, because in physics, in about 2005, maybe a little bit earlier, there was the idea of the multiverse, many universes. And he thought, Habermas thought, we have to get away from this idea of one, or oneness, that a lot of mystical people describe what they're missing. They want to be at one with the universe. This is the way they put it. And he thought that this is where it came from, that there is one cosmos and we want to be fully a part of it. Well, I always thought this was wrong, and I started researching my book with Nietzsche, the German philosopher, who famously said, as I'm sure you all know, God is dead, we have killed him. This, it should be said, is said by a madman, and of course Nietzsche's views have always remained controversial, because not long after saying all this, or writing all this, he himself, suffering from syphilis, went mad. He suffered from general paralysis of the insane, tertiary syphilis, and for the last 10 years of his life was catatonic. So obviously people said, is this the most brilliant piece of philosophy, or is it the meanderings of a madman? I'll leave you to make up your own minds about that. But people sometimes say to me when discussing my book, why did you start with Nietzsche? Why didn't you start with Darwin? Or somewhere else? And I say, well, Darwin actually was quite religious, although he had this theory of evolution which really put the boot into religion. He himself was fairly religious, whereas Nietzsche was a wonderful atheist, a fantastic writer, and there was a real resonance. People really responded to Nietzsche. And to begin with, in Germany, there was a Nietzsche cult, which in a sense replaced God. And these people believed there were Nietzsche evenings where Nietzsche was discussed, his favorite music, which was Wagner, was played, and people would discuss what we're going to do now that God is dead. The first response in Germany was, surprisingly as it may seem, dance. Nietzsche said in one of his writings, a day without dancing is a day wasted. And he was known in some quarters as the dancing philosopher. And they developed in Ascona in Switzerland a sort of dance camp run by a man some of you will have heard of, Rudolf Laban, who was eventually an exile in Britain, and Mary Wigman and Isadora Duncan. And they all went for a dance camp on the slopes of the mountains and would discuss philosophy and then dance the night through. And Ascona made lots of money out of these people, and they were very, very welcome. It was like an early form of counterculture. And vagabondage was another big thing that people liked to do in those days, which is say you divested yourself of all your possessions and hit the road. Again, a little bit like the later counterculture. This is all forgotten now, but this was the great fashion in the late 19th century. But I don't think I'd call that a big response. The big responses really, since then, have fallen into 4 areas: politics, art, philosophy, and psychology. And these are the areas that people who have not believed in God have involved themselves in. Now, I'm not going to say too much about politics, because I think most people will be familiar with what the Bolsheviks did in Stalinist Russia, starting up counter churches. The number of churches in Soviet Russia dropped from 40,000 to 4,000 between 1918 and 1941. The number of Islamic schools dropped from over 200 to 7 in the same period. And so the Bolsheviks tried to kill off religion. They called it scientific atheism. And I'm sure you've read of this, the most famous things where they doused one of the archbishops. They put him in a school playground and played water over him. And of course it froze. And he was just a solid block of ice, and obviously died. And that's how they killed off religion, by killing off the leaders. On the other hand, the fascists in Germany tried to come up with their own replacement religion, which is a form of paganism. And again, that is generally well known. But with art, at the time that Nietzsche lived, art, I think I can say this even here, art was much more important then than it is now. Now, I'm not saying that art isn't important now. I'm just saying it was more important then, and people really believed that they could get answers to the meaning of life through art. And I'll just show, I have some illustrations here. I've only got, my printing ran out, but I'm just going to hand these round, and if you could pass them around. This sort of shows how serious art was at the time. This first one is a picture I'm sure you'll all know, George Seurat's Sunday Afternoon on the Island of the Grand Jade. And what people don't notice a lot about this picture is that on the right there's a very smart couple dressed in black and grey. And it's Sunday, it says. So they've just been to church. And they're over here on the high ground, maybe the moral high ground. And they're looking at everybody else in the park. And almost everybody in the park, there are two things they have in common. One, they're facing away from the churchgoers. And two, they're locked in their own world. Hardly anybody's talking to anybody else. And this was obviously Seurat's, or seems to me this was Seurat's idea, that this was the new world in which we were living. That it was a very pleasurable, a very beautiful new world, but we're all in it on our own. And that we're not in the church, if you like, and we've not got too much in the way of companionship. And this, I think, puts a new light on the Seurat painting, which is absolutely gorgeous, as I'm sure that you will remember. Alongside that, in the theatre, you had the work of Ibsen, George Bernard Shaw, and Chekhov, amongst others. I can't talk about everybody. And Shaw there had a phrase in one of his plays, "Heaven is not a place, it's a direction." And this really sums up what I think the theatre was doing in those days. In Ibsen's plays, you then find that people want to achieve, they have a rich inner life, they're not terribly religious, and they want to create something lasting. And the problem of the plays is the resistance of the world to stop them creating something lasting. Shaw was probably the most political of the playwrights. He is forever going on about there's nothing above, there's only ahead. And we have to move forward. He was a great Darwinist, he was a great follower of Nietzsche, and he believed that he said in one of his works, every individual is the chance to make things better. And that is what our concentration should be. Chekhov had this phrase, do not look into the distance. He did not believe in big life, in great abstractions. He believed in specific deeds to make the world better. And he says in one of his plays, the important thing is to be heroic in a small individual life. This is what we should look out for, heroism in everyday life. And of course that links up with James Joyce. I mean, Ulysses is specifically about Stephen Dedalus and his companions being heroic in the space of that one Bloomsday. That's why it is described in so much detail, interminable detail for many people, though I think it's a lovely book. And this is, again, what he is saying. In philosophy and in psychology, the interesting thing is, at the time that God was dying, and Nietzsche said what he said in 1882, two very interesting things were happening, one much better known than the other. The better known thing was the development of Freud, and the new psychology that he introduced. And throughout the 20th century, psychology became more and more important as, I think, perhaps two things worth saying. One, that although Freud began by treating mental illness and neurosis, later in the 20th century, certainly after the Second World War, many psychotherapists, if not most, weren't treating mental illness as we understood it traditionally, but were treating people's almost philosophical problems, the problem of the meaning of life and the problems of solitude and so on. And there was that change in the 20th century. The philosophical thing that came in was, it's a very ugly word, the philosophy of phenomenology, difficult to say sometimes, introduced by Edmund Husserl, a German philosopher. And his idea was like Chekhov. We should eschew big things. We should eschew abstractions. Abstractions, he said, take us away from reality. The belief that the general, which of course is the concern of religion and of science, the belief that the general is more important than the particular is wrong. What we need, and I think it was a happy phrase, is faith in detail. This is how we should lead our lives. And he was not alone in this. Here in France, Mallarmé had the phrase of les minutes heureuses, the little happinesses. Gide had a lovely phrase. He spoke of the voluptuousness of objects, that individual things, and he spoke about the thingness of things, that this is how to enjoy life, to be aware of the very little things in life. And I think that led on in time to a great concern, and this runs through the writings of 20th century people, the importance of poetry, the poetic, even philosophers said this, the poetic approach to life, to observe it as it goes by and try to find a new form of words that enlarges us, is as much as we can hope for. This was true too of painting. I mean, if you look at Robert Hughes's book, The Shock of the New, there are 286 illustrations in his book. Only 9 can be construed as religious, and in many cases you have to stretch a point. Painting, 20th century painting, is the most secular activity in which I think we've been involved. And the whole of the Impressionist saga looks at the bountiful nature of life. I mean, if you look at Monet's series. I think he painted something like 30, 31 paintings of Rouen Cathedral. Now it's a cathedral, yes, but it's the front of the cathedral. And some are purple, some are red, some are white, some are grey. He's really treating the cathedral as a secular object of beauty, just as he treated the railway stations with all the steam and the comings and goings and so forth. Matisse treated colour. Matisse worshipped colour. All his paintings, those Fauvist paintings, they're all red and the most unlikely colours, but now look how beautiful we think they are. They're most unlikely. Others worship speed. Allied to the poetic approach to life, you find with many of the writers the worship of the moment. Many people, Joyce was one of them, advance the view that, quite frankly, you can't enjoy life or find meaning every hour of every day. It's beyond us. And Virginia Woolf spoke of her cotton wool days. She said most of her life she was wrapped in cotton wool. But there were moments in her life when she absolutely came alive. I'll mention some of the other people who shared her view. Ibsen mentioned flashes of spiritual value. Kandinsky, in his work on the spirit of art, Little Pleasures. Yeats, brief moments of ecstatic affirmation. Shaw, infinitesimal increments. Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet, spoke of the shimmer of reality, comes into view and goes out again. Mandelstam, nuggets of harmony. Robert Lowell, bolts of clarification. Joyce spoke of his epiphanies, and the Spanish-American philosopher Santayana spoke of spontaneous affirmation. So here we have a collection of people, important writers, very bright people, saying the idea that you have in a religion, that you have this oneness with a nation, with God, that will last forever, is simply untenable. Life isn't like that, and we have to grow up and appreciate that we can only have moments. Yes, we can try and extend those moments, but we must not expect them ever to last for more than a few moments. Switchbacking completely. At the outbreak of World War I, and World War I is on all our minds at the moment, an American historian wrote a book called Redemption by War, and it's about 1914. And when you study the history of 1914, it's amazing the number of people who welcomed the war. I mean, now we know what happened, but of course in 1914 they all thought it would be over by Christmas. But they thought that the war would be unbelievably cleansing, that it would account for a spiritual renewal. There hadn't been a war, a big war, for a century, since 1815. The world had been rather largely at peace, and people thought that Germany, Britain, and France in particular were decaying, degenerate, and that what was exactly needed was a fabulous war in which people would embrace, they would become more than they were, they would work together in a community. And the Germans went so far as to print 150,000 durable copies of Nietzsche's book, in which he said God is dead, and gave them to the German forces. And a lot of people in France and in Britain therefore blamed Nietzsche for the war, although he'd been dead for over 20 years by then, both for the event of the war and for the brutality with which it was carried out. But it is amazing, I don't expect everyone to do this, but if you do read the history of 1914, it's quite extraordinary the extent to which people welcomed the war. moving from one war to another, World War II had a big influence on attitudes to God, and one can see why. There were at least two apocalypses. There was obviously the Holocaust, and there was the atomic bomb, in the plural. And the responses to this were quite extraordinary in some ways. One of the Jewish responses was to say, well, one Jewish leader called Hitler Nebuchadnezzar, because the view was that the reason the Holocaust happened, and I think this takes the biscuit, the reason the Holocaust happened is that the Jews hadn't been religious enough. It was their fault. This was quite, this had quite a lot of play at the time. We tend to forget it now. Other Jews said, well, let's face it, I didn't believe that God was dead when Nietzsche said it, but I do believe that God is dead now. And there was a whole death of God scenario in Jewish history. In Christian history, there was the same death of God. It's called thanatology, theology. Death of God theology. There were a whole bunch of mainly American Christian theologians who concluded that, yes, God was dead, sort of. We can't really imagine what he's thinking now, but therefore all we can do is wait. And we have to wait without worship, we just wait. And if there is a God, he will show himself, or she will show himself. Because there's nothing we can think of that, we can't define a God who's so evil, weak, negative, to allow these terrible happenings. So far as I know, these people are still waiting. The other effect of World War II, particularly in America, was a lot of young people who'd been abroad and had all sorts of adventures, including emotional and sexual adventures. When they came back, there was no way that particularly American society was going to be like it was before the war. And in America, you then get what was called the permissive turn. Not just in sexual behavior, but this was the time of Benjamin Spock, who had trained as a psychoanalyst and introduced a far more permissive way of parenting. And life really eased and freed up in the wake of the war, added to which a man called Joshua Lieberman, who is forgotten now, but whose book was on the New York Times bestseller list for a record number of weeks before Norman Vincent Peale's book on How to Win Friends and Influence People. And he said, the church is over. The church has been replaced by dynamic Freudian psychology. And we need in the church to adjust to this and make arrangements accordingly. And this was the great growth of what came to be called pastoral psychology, when huge numbers of vicars and priests and so forth trained in psychology. And whilst this was okay for the church, it really did lead to the efflorescence of psychotherapy without religion that took off in the late 50s and 60s and ended up, according to whichever source you read, something like 146 different kinds of psychotherapy being available to people, mainly, as I said earlier, having to do with desire. And this was, I think, Freud's great insight, that neither the church nor evolutionary theory, which came later, really understood desire. Most of culture, most novels, most operas, when you think about it, are about desire in one form or another. Desire as the thing that brings two people together, but equally importantly, desire that drives them apart in sexual jealousy and rivalry. And Eugene O'Neill, the great American, in my view, America's greatest playwright, all his plays are really about desire and the pathology of desire. And it seems to me that this is the one thing that is still out there, if you like, the one thing that we are still concerned about. The one thing that we haven't got right is the management of desire. And desire, I think, is an important part of the meaning of life. And being able to, what you say, tame desire, restrict it, organize it, is part of the most important aspect of living. And this addresses directly, I think, we're all living at a time when we hear evolutionary theory, and evolution explains this, and evolution explains that. And I think it's true. I think evolution does explain a huge amount of things, but I don't think it comes close to explaining desire. And Noam Chomsky said, the problems of life are better addressed by novels than by scientists. Now, this is not true of all problems, obviously. We came on a train today. But it is true, I think, that the important part of cultural life, the understanding of the moral dilemmas that people get themselves into through the flourishing and the pathology of desire. You learn much more about it by reading good novels, I think, or watching good films and so forth, than you'll ever learn from science. And desire and detail, it seems to me, are the big things to bear in mind in the absence of God. That these are the things that will give us a meaningful, pleasurable life, to manage our desire, but to pay attention to the details of life. And I'm going to end by just quoting some of the things that poets have said down the years along these lines. I'm a great fan here in the American Library of Wallace Stevens, by far and away, in my view, the best American poet. And he, if I can find my notes, he never shirked this this problem, the problem of replacing religion with poetry. Let me just bear with me while I... Poetry, exceeding music, must take the place of empty heaven and its hymns. A poet looks out on the world somewhat as a man looks at a woman. The imperfect is our only paradise. My favourite, we never arrive intellectually. You can't arrive intellectually, but emotionally we arrive constantly. Things simply are, and are not moulded to a human purpose. There is a neverthelessness about nature. Life lived on the basis of opinion is more nearly life than life lived without opinions. Poetry is unfenced existence. I think all those are lovely. And perhaps I can end with even better lines in some ways of W.H. Auden. Let us grieve not, rather find strength in what remains behind. I don't think much at the moment could be done to stop it. There's a lot of pathology of desire as well. I mean, we seem, certainly in Britain, to be sort of surrounded by illegal desire of adults for children, for instance, and of violent desire, sexual abuse. And I agree that these are problems, but I do think that they go back to, take us back to Freud in identifying desire. I mean, I know that a lot of Freud's theories have been criticized, but I think that his putting desire center stage is absolutely the right thing to do. And in a way, I'm rather glad you're shocked, because I think that we should be shocked. And I think that people, it's clear to me that we need, people need to be taught about desire. Children need to be taught about desire. I mean, for instance, Bertrand Russell had what I think is a very interesting idea. He said children become sexually active or sexually interested 11, 12, 13. So teach them the facts of life when they're 8, when they don't have any desire, when it's just news, and they'll be well aware of it, rather than teaching it to them when they're playing catch-up. And I think that's well worth considering, more so perhaps now. It's not an ideal answer, that, but I don't think there is an ideal answer. Yes, I don't think desire for things is anywhere near as intense as the biological desires. Eugene O'Neill wrote about desire for revenge is quite strong. That's a form of desire. He writes about desire for property and equality in inheritance and so forth. And you can call all those desires. I think they're wants rather than desires. I think that the importance of the biological importance of sexual desire is very important for leading a stable, meaningful life. That's all I was trying to say. I don't really think atheism is a religion. I think agnosticism is kind of, I think in Britain we call it a kind of liberal democrat idea. It's sort of between the devil and the deep blue sea. There's nothing wrong with being agnostic, but I don't think it takes us anywhere. To discuss why you're agnostic, it's on the one hand this, on the one hand that. Atheism is, in some ways, yes, it means something, but you could be atheistic in many, many different ways, and with more and more knowledge, or less and less knowledge. I mean, I do say in my book that a lot of people are just not troubled by these questions. They've got more important things to worry about, getting through day in, day out. I mean, when I was researching my book, a lot of people say, oh, I never think about it. I just lead my life. And maybe those are the real secular people. Maybe they're the real atheists, and maybe they're the happiest. These big questions don't trouble them, whereas they do trouble some people, some of us, which is why I began and ended with Habermas, as somebody who was really troubled by these things. I mean, if you study the history of religion, you start with shamanism, which is the worship of the wild, and then after the invention of agriculture, when people settled down in villages and domesticated animals and plants, you get the great mother god. And one of the reasons for this, which I discuss in one of my books, is that there must have been a time in history, when you think about it, when people had not made the link between sexual intercourse and birth. After all, it's 9 months. And at that time, women would have seemed even more miraculous than they are now, because they suddenly swell up and give birth. And what has recently been found, this will sound like a technical thing, but it isn't, is that the female pelvic canal is very susceptible to diet. And from the analysis of ancient skeletons, hunter-gatherer women had wider pelvic canals than women in domesticated agricultural, eating wheat and so forth, closed up them. And I can not be the only person in this room who's crossed your mind that why, after generations of evolution, is birth still not straightforward? It was much easier in ancient times than it is now. So this pressure that it put on women, who were both more miraculous and it was more dangerous, from about 10,000 BC to about 4,000, 3,000 BC, ancient peoples worshipped the mother goddess. Male gods only come in during the Bronze Age, when with the domestication of the horse and developments in the chariot was invented, and you got the development of palace states in the Middle East and widespread warfare, when the male attributes of strength and aggression and fighting come in, and you get a change from female gods to male gods. And then you get a further subsequent change with Zoroaster, who said that he'd been told by the gods to calm the world down, and you get what is called in anthropological the Axial Age, the great turning inward of Hinduism, Confucianism, Upanishadic Hinduism, and the prophets in Israel, and then you get the development of monotheism and the world that we know now. So that's the way it developed. Though when I was mentioning the responses to World War II, there was a lot of theology by women saying that we should understand God more as a woman than as a man, because look where the male God has got us, and if we understand the values of femininity, of caring and so forth, we'd all be much better off. Too long an answer, sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah. I have quite a lot to say about that, and I recommend you read, for instance, Wittgenstein on religion. What he says is, and again we come back to poetry and language, and he says mysticism comes from our inability to describe all of our experience. We have language, but in many ways it's not enough. And as you may know, Wittgenstein was a teacher at Cambridge. I'll rephrase that, a university lecturer at Cambridge. And a couple of times he stopped being a university lecturer and went to teach school children. And what he said about this was there are things you can do as a teacher that you can't put into words. And this is where the mystical comes from. And that teaching is a spiritual activity in this way because you can inspire people. And his answer to the meaning of life, if you like, was to inspire people, which is also Antoine Saint-Exupéry. We haven't mentioned the existentialist in France. And Antoine Exupéry had a wonderful phrase, the warmth of acts. That acts rather than words bring a warmth to the world, and you can inspire people with your deeds. And Wittgenstein recognized this, and this is why he went teaching. There were things he thought that he could show children that he couldn't tell them. You know, he said, we'll do it this way, but you can't actually put it into words. And if you go to the Tottenham Court Road in London, where they sell a lot of computers and all that kind of, it's full of geeks and so forth. If you ask them some advice, they can show you. It's very hard for them to put it into words. It's not quite what Wittgenstein meant, I don't think, but it is an interesting thing. So I do think there is a need for spirituality, yes, but we don't yet fully understand what we mean by spirituality. Wittgenstein was trying to get at it, and I think words like inspiration come close, like that boy who was diagnosed with cancer and raised £3 million on the internet before dying, I mean, that was inspiring. That was the fuss we had last week in England about the teacher who was stabbed 7 times. It was obviously a very inspiring teacher. Teaching for your friends is not a bad answer to your question. I mean, there is a specific answer to this, and I'm not really the person to give it, but if you study the various Gospels of the Apocrypha, and the Gnostic Gospels that were found at Nag Hammadi and so forth after the war, and there's now a book just come out about all these, all those early Gospels speak about women and having women in the church and all this fuss about whether Jesus was married and so forth. And it's generally held that this was a political thing, having to do with the difference between Greece and Rome being a very masculine society and so forth. So there is a technical answer to that, if you want to follow it through. The big difference, really, about Christianity, it's more about Christianity than Islam, is that where it turned out that Christians have been lucky is that Jesus didn't write anything. And so the Gospels put together what people think he said, and it's the sort of idea of him, what he really meant, as produced theology. Oh, Mark didn't mean this, he meant that, Luke didn't mean this, he meant that, and that produced St. Augustine and the great theologians of the high Middle Ages. And so we ended up first with theology and then with science, which came out of theology, whereas with Islam, the second chapter of the Quran says, this is the final word, there is nothing else to be said, it's perfect. And so Islam, as an idea, cannot go anywhere. You have the hadith, which are the supposed sayings of the Prophet, but not of God. And so Islam is much more constricted. And so, however many heads they cut off, they may have a political victory for a short time, but the ideas are going nowhere. It is static faith. And therefore, I don't see how it can possibly lead. I mean, it will be attractive to people who are losing. I mean, it's a silly analogy, but, it's like when you're at a dinner party, and it's always the person who's losing the argument that loses his temper. And it's usually a he, too. When you're losing the argument, you've got nothing but to do to cut somebody's head off. And I just think Islam has lost the argument. I mean, there's nothing new about that, but this is a flowering up. Now, of course, this is to ignore all the mismanagement of Bush and Blair and so forth, which is a separate issue. I'm not here to talk about that.